The Hauraki Gulf. Kia ora, I'm Mandy, TV presenter, environmentalist, keen fisher and concerned. The Hauraki Gulf is in trouble. Join me to find out why and how we can heal the Hauraki. This series is going to be confronting, soul-searching and enlightening. Let's go! Aotearoa's Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, Te Kapamoana and Te Moana Nui Atoi, stretching from Te Arai to Waihi. Beautiful, biodiverse, unique in our world. A treasure for tangata whenua, it's always provided what we love and what we need. From above it looks spectacular, but beneath the surface, it's a different story. It's actually on the brink of ecological collapse. How did this happen? And what can we do? In this series, we'll take a deep dive into the Hauraki Gulf to understand what is making our sea sick. In this episode, we're going to explore how unique and environmentally important the Gulf is, the incredible abundance that was, and how it's looking now.
The Hauraki Gulf is New Zealand's only national park of the sea. It's the only one we have. About 1,000 years ago, the Hauraki Gulf was basically the Yellowstone National Park of the international marine ecosystems.
On a global scale, it's a very magic piece of estate, and we're, as Aucklanders would, and New Zealanders, we should be very, very proud to have it.
So New Zealand is the global centre of seabird diversity. There's about 350 seabird species in the world. We have over 85 of them.
There's a lot of New Zealanders do not realise that there are whales that live all year round in the Hauraki Gulf.
But the fact that it's so close to downtown Auckland, there are very few places in the world that have life like we have here in the Hauraki Gulf on the back doorstep of a large city like Auckland.
When we use the word Māori, he taonga tēnā, a treasure, we do see the Hauraki Gulf as a living thing to be treasured. I treasure being able to go for a swim or go for a paddleboard. I treasure being able to catch a snapper or just be able to glance out onto the bay and the mental well-being and the calming effect that the ocean brings.
It was one of the most productive, richest marine habitats on the planet. And then humans arrived.
How many fish you got on board? Nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bins. There's 6 bins in there, guys, and you got no fish.
Too many fish.
Hey, be nice.
Yeah, look at you raping it out here. You're raping our ocean. We'll see you next time.
The pink mau mau incident down here is a real horror story, and they were being absolutely hammered. On one particular day, there was at least 2,000 fish came out of here. The concern was that it's not actually illegal.
I didn't know that until this happened, and I'm the Minister of Fisheries. I thought the bag limit applied to everything, so yeah, that regulation needs to be tightened and tightened quickly.
Once upon a time, the Gulf was bursting with life. We were living our best life. These rich and resourceful waters were the supermarket for everyone.
When the first New Zealanders stepped off the Waka, around 1250, they met a place of unbelievable abundance.
The ocean was our pātaka kai, was where we would have our meals. So every day my father would go out and you could go out and there'd be a whole line of crayfish, scallops, mussels.
I used to remember asking my mother, what's for breakfast this morning, Mum? And she'd go, oh, flounder. And we're going, oh God, not flounder.
Walking to school with my twin sister and our cousins, being able to stop and pick a handful of pippies and cook them on a hot plate that was down at the beach at the time. You know, they were the things that we really looked forward to doing.
I've got photos of my dad with crayfish, by the horns, down to his feet.
There used to be boil-ups, the birds, the kawa birds, the gannets, bomb.
We're talking about hectares and hectares of fish. The surface would move and it would look black with the backs of the petrels.
Back in the old days, you could say, yep, the barrier, you're guaranteed to get your quota, you come back with a bin full of fish. Big snapper, like big snapper,
We would take a dinghy out at Aotea and be able to feed our whole village with kai without going very far at all.
It was easy just to go down, grab a couple of crays and back out. And the paua, I remember as a little kid being able to walk on the rocks knee deep and get paua.
You'd be woken in the morning by the sound of seagulls crying and oyster catchers and terns flying overhead and making that beautiful little twittering sound.
The Hauraki Gulf used to have hundreds and hundreds of square kilometres of dense mussel beds.
When early Māori were observed fishing for crays, all they needed to do was walk out onto one of the nearshore reefs over here, shuffle along the reef until they stood on one, pick it up, fling it onto the beach, and they'd be picking up a dozen crays in 15 minutes.
We'd use crayfish shells for dog kennels. And I cracked up laughing, eh? And I sat there and I was thinking either that's a damn small as dog or it's a big ass crayfish. Aye. Our Gulf in that time, it was abundant.
If you look at the ocean right now, if you're out on a boat or you're strolling along the beach, everything looks hunky-dory. It's not until you get under the waves where you start to see where we've absolutely wrought devastation. It's a graveyard out there.
We're at Otata Island in the Hauraki Gulf, over the scallop bed that used to be here. It's about 8 metres deep.
To be honest, it is really disappointing. I knew I wasn't going to find much, but you literally see no fish at all, nothing. So.
How did it change from incredible abundance to a graveyard? When Europeans settled around the Hauraki Gulf in the later 1800s, that's really when a commercial fishing industry was established, and the Hauraki Gulf was the first place for that. And we brought in methods from overseas, including bottom trawling and then Danish seining. I think people then had a very rudimentary understanding of the marine environment, and they thought the fish were endless and they didn't see how we could have any effect.
But as industrialisation came on, boats got bigger, more powerful. The war had developed quite good sonar gear and fish finding gear. And as that technology was deployed into fishing, well, suddenly catches became much larger and depletion was noticeable right from that time on.
In the 1950s and 60s, there was a massive fishery for greenlet mussels in the Firth of Thames. That's now gone because of dredging and also sedimentation.
And so between 1950 and today, there's been a huge collapse. The shape of the graph just goes off a cliff.
I think we really started to notice the declines in the late 70s. It was at the time when people got scuba gear, so they started diving. So the shallow crayfish all went, and the snapper started to really decline.
Around about the late 70s, early 80s, we noticed a definite decline in the flounder. In fact, it's not just a decline, it was almost like overnight. The flounders disappeared. So when I asked Mum what's for breakfast, it was wheat bix and a bit of off milk. And we're going, what's wrong? Something's wrong here.
You know, the fishermen would get annoyed because their trawl nets would be cut up by the mussels and other shellfish beds on the seabed, so they'd just get two boats, they'd get a chain and they'd just drag them through and smash up those reefs, and so they could trawl. And that's why you see in the Hauraki Gulf now, most of it is soft muddy sediment, but originally it wasn't. It was just full of rich mussel beds and horse mussel beds, and you talk to fishermen and they say, we used to fish over those mussel beds and the catches were much higher, because that's where the food and the habitat, and those are the productive abundant areas, and we've lost all those. So does that mean there's not plenty more fish in the sea, and she won't be right, mate? Tell me more.
being next to New Zealand's biggest city, Auckland, means there's a lot of recreational pressure. There's a bit of effluent still comes out of Auckland and comes into the Gulf. The other pressures are sediment coming out of the Waikato area. The third challenge is fishing pressure. Some of it's recreational, some of it's commercial.
So one of the things we did with New Zealand Geographic very early on in the process was look very closely at the hierarchy of risks and the hierarchy of impacts of everything that is happening in the Hauraki Gulf to understand what are the things that are making the biggest difference out here. And we discovered very, very early on that it was destructive fishing practices, then it was commercial fishing and recreational fishing. It's even. And after that, a long way further down, is things like sedimentation, invasive species, and plastics pretty much at the bottom of the list.
On one side, it has declining water quality running into it. On the other side, we have extraction of fish and shellfish and things. And so between the two of these, it's not surprising that the state of the Hauraki Gulf is continuing to slowly erode away.
We've let it get to a level now where it's at the tipping point. And if we don't do something very quickly, we're going to lose a whole bunch of different animals from that, and that's going to affect everybody.
If you've grown up here and you know where all the good spots are and that, you notice that they're just not there anymore.
We dove 18,000 square metres out here. We should have been seeing 800, 1,000 crayfish, and we saw 23. To have them only now in little spots is chasing the last remnants of those populations.
We're eating the Hauraki Gulf to death.
You realise that when you're being hit during the week by commercial fishing pressure, and then you're being hit in the weekend by this kind of increased recreational fishing, the place doesn't get a break.
The scallop fishery's gone like that. It's gone from a lot to virtually nothing, and it's flatlining at close to nothing.
You lose that mauri. You lose that mauri and they will leave us, like so many species have done in the past.
In my years of experience of swimming in and surfing in the Gulf, and more recently as a scientist trying to understand the impacts to the Gulf, and even more recently trying to understand from a Mataranga Māori perspective, the Gulf is dying by 1,000 cuts.
No way. Po te kapa moana te moana nui a toi. It's not like dying though, is it?
Across about half of the reef systems in the Gulf, we're seeing signs of trophic cascade, which is an ecosystem collapse. If you imagine the ecosystem as like a skyscraper, where each part of the food chain fulfills its own particular role. When you start removing parts of that food chain, it's like knocking out columns, and you take out one and it's still standing. You take out 2, 3, 4, 5 and it's standing. You knock out one more and the whole thing comes down. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, is this collapse of the ecosystem all the way down until you're left with nothing but rubble.
But at its extreme, trophic cascades end up with jellyfish. There are places in some parts of the world that have been so heavily fished, there's no commercial fishing possible because all they catch is jellyfish. And so if we keep putting this sort of pressure on the Hauraki Gulf, that's all we'll be left with. So I just want people to realise that that's the consequence of continuing to put this kind of pressure on a marine environment. It's not good.
Well, it took millions of years to evolve. We've managed to stuff it up in about 80.
The culprits are ourselves. We're not looking after this taonga, whether that be central government, regional, local, it's everyday people, because we know what we need to do to treasure this beautiful space that we've been given.
As a monumental action toward protection, the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park was formed in 2000, the first marine national park in New Zealand, covering 1.2 million hectares and 50 islands. A bold initiative, but what's been achieved in 22 years?
We were already acutely aware of the degradation that was occurring in the Gulf, of species collapse even back there, and particularly the impact of overfishing. So we believe that the Gulf Islands should be made a marine park, and that that park should have a strong legislative environmental emphasis.
we had the first marine reserves in the world. But today it occupies about 0.37% of our entire exclusive economic zone. Internationally, scientists reckon that the safe number is around about 30%. So we're a very long way off, we're 100 times off.
I had high hopes, as many Aucklanders did, for the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, but it hasn't delivered much.
Less than 0.5% of protection in 22 years, even after 6 bleak reports.
But if you look at the scientific reports, which I find progressively more difficult to read, they're heartbreaking. They reflect the greatest act of environmental vandalism in New Zealand's history, in my view. This has happened in the Gulf on the watch of a generation who knew better.
Every 3 years since, the Forum has put out a report that has painted a bleaker and bleaker picture of what's happening behind me.
And the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park is such an expansive area. We have 26 iwi interests in there and 6 councils. So to get that many people to agree is always going to be a huge task.
And so we've now got past that point where people are arguing about whether it needs saving. This is now the point where we have to save it.
And we brought together, rec fishers, commercial fishers, iwi leaders, environmentalists, farmers, infrastructure people, and we spent 3 years, and it was a pretty hard, tough process.
So Sea Change was a massive effort through a collaborative process to establish a marine spatial plan for the Hauraki Gulf.
And I will be forever grateful to Eugenie Sage for pulling that document off the shelf, dusting it off and saying, what are we going to do about it?
And we've established a ministerial advisory group to develop a path to implement the 180 recommendations that were in Sea Change.
Well, all right, that's good news. After many, many years, the government finally responded to Sea Change with an action plan, revitalised the Gulf. But only a handful of the 180 recommendations are in the action plan. Is that enough?
We're really happy to see a whole lot more seafloor protection. That's the base of the entire ecosystem out there in the Gulf. And we're also really happy to see those new marine protected areas coming through. But it's a little bit light on restoration. We need a lot more money going into replacing our lost shellfish beds, to planting up the waterways. And then the other thing it's light on is the land-based impacts into the Gulf.
It's not fair to say that governments have not done anything in the past. They've actually done quite a few things. They just haven't done enough.
They could have been more ambitious. I mean, to only end up with 6% protection in the high protection zone, I think is a big fail.
10% is nowhere near enough. 30% is what marine science is calling for.
So of course many of the recommendations that were coming through from the Hauraki Gulf reports suggested, hey, maybe we should explore things like marine protected areas, marine no-take reserves and those kind of things. And often they were met with quite vehement opposition. And I couldn't understand it, but then of course it's the NIMBY effect, it's the, yeah, in principle that sounds great, but not in my backyard. I want to be able to get a feed of scallops and crayfish and snapper and what have you. When it came to the crunch, people didn't want to feel like it was them being impacted.
And the fact that we have the new protections and are still allowing destructive fishing practices in the Hauraki Gulf is beyond the pale. It is an indefensible position in terms of public or scientific policy.
So, a bit broken all round really, like my heart actually. Next up, and it's a biggie, overfishing. Who's really to blame? Commercial or recreational fishers? There's a lot of finger pointing. Get ready, this is confronting.